Mailman. I woke the same as any other day, except a voice was in my head. I've had voices in my head for as long as I could remember, but this one was different somehow. More corporeal. Cheerier? I turned to face it, realizing mid-turn what an utterly ridiculous notion that was. How could I possibly expect to address something that wasn't even there? Imagine then my surprise when the owner of the voice turned out to be none other than someone not in my head. "Seize the day," he said. "Pull the trigger, drop the blade, and watch the rolling heads." I couldn't immediately recognize him. Tall, blonde guy. Mid-20s maybe? Immaculate white hoodie, piercing emerald eyes. His perfect teeth sparkled gloriously like he was in a toothpaste commercial or something. "What's that?" I mumbled sleepily, knocking over several empty bottles as I stumbled out of bed. My hangover was still present. It had been there for months now. Drinking heavily obviously wasn't the solution. "You gotta get up and at 'em, Chris," he said cheerily. "You're coming with me today. That ought to cheer you up." He winked, and sauntered out of my bedroom gracefully. I followed him diligently, my unbalanced exit not nearly as elegant. I think we made it all the way to the front door before I started questioning what was going on. "Hey, wait a minute," I said confusedly. "Who the hell are you?" He turned on his heel, his long blonde hair doing that thing you'll see in shampoo commercials. "You know who I am, Chris, don't be daft," he grinned. "You've been calling me for months now." "What?" I asked. "Wait, who?" "Come along now, Christopher. We'll have time for one-syllable questions later," he said, disappearing out the door. I guess I just stood for a minute trying to reboot my consciousness. To be fair to my brain, I hadn't really been giving it the best working conditions these past few months, so it wasn't solely to blame for the slow reset. After getting it back online, and reassuring it that yes, this was all very surreal, I followed the man outside. "There we are, Chris," he said, beckoning me to join him as he paced down the street. "We'll have lots of fun today, believe me. Might even make you reconsider your choices." We slowly walked past Mrs. Cameron's property just as the mailman pulled in. I never really liked him. Short, stubby guy, with a monstrous mustache. He never seemed to smile either. I guess that's the first thing that threw me off. The unnervingly wide grin manifesting on his grubby face as he noticed us. "Mr. S, good to see ya," the mailman said, raising his hand in greeting. "Cornell," the man tipped an imaginary hat, and bowed gracefully. "Up to no good, I hope?" "You know it, Mr. S," he chuckled, and shuffled up the stairs toward Mrs. Cameron's house. "You know my mailman?" I asked dumbfoundedly. Chris, he gave me a pat on the back. "I know you all. You all come to me in time of need, and you are also very, very needy." I stared at the mailman as he hopped up to Mrs. Cameron's front door. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something seemed different about him. Something felt really, really off. As it turns out, I was only half right. It was something really, really out. "Is he?" I mumbled. "Is that his innards? Guts? Intestines?" "Yes, quite the astute observation, Christopher," Mr. S said. It wasn't very hard to see now that I was aware of them. Flopping around disgustingly as his stubby persona struggled with the steps. The wound in his abdomen was exposed, a perfectly cut vertical slit from his chest down to his groin. If I wasn't already sick to my stomach from the hangover, I would have doubled over and vomited what little content I had left from the night before. "You see things as they're now, Chris," Mr. S said, grinning widely. "You're finally living." I don't understand," I said, gawping at the horrible sight of it. "Cornell here isn't a good man," he said, waving his finger from side to side. "In fact, I've yet to meet a good man. Or woman. You all have these yawning chasms of wonderful diabolical potential. Design flaw I suppose. Any which way, he decided that gutting his mother for the inheritance was a good way of tapping into that potential. I was there to help him pin it on his brother. Rather dreary deal, I must confess, but it all wrapped up rather nicely." "So he got away with it?" I asked, still struggling to take my eyes off the dancing guts spraying blood everywhere. "No one truly gets away with it, Christopher," he laughed heartily. "They all get what's coming to them in the end." We started walking again when Mrs. Cameron answered the door. Such a sweet old lady, Mrs. Cameron. Brought me dinner for a week after Ember died. Even came to the funeral. I think she was the only one of my neighbors who attended. The rest of them couldn't even look me in the fucking eyes. "Are you the devil?" I suddenly asked. I suppose I needed to know just who I was dealing with. Are you the human? He chuckled. It's a pointless concept, Chris. Let it go. Enjoy life now that you're truly living it. He sat down on the bench by the bus stop, whistling a discordant tune. I joined him, and shuffled awkwardly back and forth as he kept changing positions. I suppose we must have been sitting there for quite a while doing nothing when Mr. Shepard popped out from his house across the street. I let out a surprised yelp at the sight of him. 9 a.m., like suicide. Such a beautiful sight, isn't he? Mr. S sang. Just like suicide. What, I murmured silently. Mr. Shepard was naked, bloated and blue, his head angled like the neck was broken or something. For some reason I grabbed onto the bench, feeling the rough wood digging into my palms. The sweet relief of pain calmed me some. Hung himself, Mr. S said. Had second thoughts just before he crossed over. Couldn't live with what he'd done, but couldn't face the other side either. We get a lot of those. What did he do? I asked, a single tear escaping my eye. Oh boy, extensive rap sheet on that one, he chuckled. Started with cats, ended with his niece. Don't worry, though, Christopher. I set up a doozy of a deal for him. He'll face the fire, have no fear. Long time coming. The bloated corpse abomination of Mr. Shepard caught sight of us, and quickly wobbled back inside again. I spotted his pale blue, dead eyes in the window soon after, peering out at us from behind bile green curtains. They can't all handle it, he patted me on the back, and stood up. Come along, Christopher. We've only just getting started. Such a wonderful day, isn't it? I glanced up to look at the sun, but it was nowhere to be found. Beneath the black the sky looked dead. I felt a harrowing cold chill enter every cell of my body as we slowly paced down the blood-stained street. Tar-black shadows and screams enveloped us in a cacophony of horror, and for a fleeting moment I remembered how it felt like to be alive. 10 a.m., limo wreck. Ah, this one should interest you, Mr. S said, pointing at the burning car wreck that used to be Mr. Artis' house. I didn't even flinch at the absurdity anymore. There was just too much of it. I guess I'd just conformed to the idea that I wasn't in control anymore. Remind you of anything? He looked at me, and laughed. It didn't, but it also did. I looked down at my feet, realizing I was still in my raggedy old pajamas, and felt an instant surge of anger rising. I was able to ignore it somehow. I suppose I knew nothing good would come of it. Yes, I just said, still staring at my bare feet. Mr. Artis sat in the driver's seat, his charred black body convulsing gruesomely. As the flesh slowly melted away, I could see his bluish veins throbbing steadily underneath. I wouldn't have recognized him if it weren't for the tattoo. He did it himself, you know. The tattoo. Artis the artist, he'd call himself. It was a fine one, to be sure. A Pontiac Firebird. Mr. Artis here left a young mother and her child to burn to death after a particularly heinous car accident, he said, peering into the window of the burning car. A white limo. You don't see limos anymore. A thing of the past. Just like me. He's been trying to reach me. Wants me to take the pain away. Still ironing out the details. What's the point to all of this? I suddenly blurted out in frustration. We're getting to that, Christopher, he chuckled. Let's cut through the park, shall we? Maybe a tint of green will help you calm down. We left the screaming Mr. Artis behind, and crossed the street. We waded through the blood and filth and fire, but it all felt perfectly natural now. Like it had always been there. 11 a.m., let me drown. I've never really enjoyed the outside very much. No ceiling, no barriers, nothing holding you back. The park was nice though. Tall trees, fresh grass, a lovely little playground. Amber always wanted kids. I was kind of on the fence about them, but she would have convinced me down the line. That's just who she was. That's just how much I loved her. There she is, Mr. S beamed, looking into the swirling black maelstrom of the sandpit. I peered over his shoulder cautiously, catching a brief glimpse of the tortured visage of Mrs. Yamamoto down there before pulling back quickly. Tiny black fingers covered her, crawled over her, reaching all the way down her throat. There had to be thousands of them. Millions. Let me drown. Mrs. Yamamoto gargled hideously. Let me drown. Lovely, Mr. S said, grinning widely. You see, Christopher? She's in pain, just like you. Just like you, she's not to fault for her torment. Innocent. Pure. Still she calls on me, to bring back her son. Perished in a pool years ago, little hero. Water in his lungs, I guess. Will you? I asked, edging away from the sandpit nervously. Will you bring him back? Half of him, perhaps, he chuckled. There's a science to these things, Christopher. That's what I'm trying to show you. We continued through the park, and I stopped briefly to smell the severnaya flowers. The stench of them reminded me of home, of sweet moments, and carefree boredom, and the bliss of not knowing. Oh, how I longed back to the super unknown. Fresh tendrils crept up my nose as I plucked one of the disfigured ones, snorting the iris seeds right into my brain. Mrs. Yamamoto kept drowning in the distance, swallowed by guilt she didn't need, and hope she didn't want. Mr. S threw his head back and laughed heartily when I told him that I felt alive. 12 o'clock, she likes surprises. We followed the flesh brick road all the way back to my street. The squelching noises beneath my bare feet didn't bother me as much anymore. The lukewarm blood filling the cracks between my toes felt strangely soothing, and I was starting to enjoy the constant smell of rot and decay too. "We'll sneak in here," Mr. S said, pointing at Mrs. Everman's house. "She likes surprises." I'm pretty sure her house wasn't normally painted in the color of millions of squirming maggots, but I could be mistaken. After all, reality is what we make of it, isn't it? A slight trauma to the head can change everything, you know. Then all of a sudden up his face, and red is left, and maggots are paint. Shh, Mr. S gestured for me to stay quiet. We don't want to wake her. We silently snuck through the house, finding Mrs. Everman asleep atop a pile of decomposing corpses in the living room. Mr. S kept pointing to the corpses, rolling his emerald eyes at me when I shrugged back at him. I was having a hard time keeping the hungry maggots from crawling all over me though, so I felt like he could cut me some slack. "What?" I whispered. "What is it?" Mr. S pointed to the corpses again, and this time it finally dawned on me what was so special about them. They were all the same corpse. Beautiful carcasses they were, a lovely young woman, now greenish and bloated and gaseous and maggot-ridden, but still gorgeous. "Her daughter," Mr. S whispered. "She disowned her 10 years ago. Died a million deaths, the pretty young thing. Before she finally ended it all in a filthy motel room. Such a waste, don't you think?" Mr. S paced back and forth between the vast pile of the same corpse and me, whistling cheerily. "Wakey wakey!" he suddenly yelled at the top of his lungs. Mrs. Everman awoke with a harrowing shriek, and then found herself slowly sinking into the rotting mound of her daughter's corpses. I could see the fear in her eyes, the absolute horror of what she was facing, but I couldn't feel anything. Mr. S doubled over with laughter while I just stood there blinking the maggots out of my eyes. "If this doesn't make you feel," he finally said, drying his tears, "it doesn't mean you've died." 1 p.m., Spoonman. We left Mrs. Everman clawing and chewing her way through the corpse mountain, and sauntered down to old Mr. Sundquist's quaint little house. I'd always adored his cozy little cottage thing, but I don't think I'll ever see it the same way again. It resembled a monstrous pile of oozing garbage, like a rotting landfill, vile, foul-smelling liquid seeping down from it. We slipped in under a torn plastic tarp, finding the naked body of Mr. Sundquist lying in a pool of disgusting sludge. "Hey, Spoonman," Mr. S said, slapping the lethargic, hollow-cheeked face of Mr. Sundquist aggressively. "Time for a refill." Mr. Sundquist sat up mechanically, producing fleshly spoons instead of fingers on his hands. Mr. S filled the wrinkly spoon limbs with a brown liquid he magicked out of thin air, before setting the whole puddle of sludge on fire with a simple snap of his fingers. We stood silently watching the old man burn, every once in a while stabbing himself with a spoon, sighing deeply as the liquid spread through his system in the shape of black pulsating veins. "Addicts are the easiest," Mr. S remarked. "No fun, really. They'll gladly sell their own spouse for another fix." Interestingly enough, that's exactly what our spoonman here did. Peddled his own wife off like she was an object. Strange old breed, you lot. You seem to have an innate penchant for self-inflicted damnation. He turned to me, smiling slyly. His piercing gaze met my tired eyes, and a nod of approval followed. "Not you though, Christopher," he said. "You're different, aren't you?" "I am?" I asked. "Head down, hide that smile," he grinned. "Still a few to go." 2 p.m., 4th of July. Mr. S whistled the same discordant tune over and over again as we continued down the street. There were only a couple of houses left, but for some reason I didn't want it to end. I looked up at the black hole sun slowly eating away at the tumorous world, and I felt a violent peace overcome me. "Let's check in on Mr. Kim real quick," Mr. S said. "He's what they call a real character." Mr. Kim was a gentle old man. Korean immigrant. The kind of person you'd swear could never even hurt a fly. Amber loved to engage with him in small talk. Real interesting guy, she'd tell me. We found him sitting on his front porch, rocking back and forth on a chair made from the body of his wife.